Welcome to QuickSpeak, the English podcast for everyone who wants to, sound more natural and confident when they speak.
Yeah.
And today, we're going to be looking at a really important part of speaking English.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be looking at how to say no,
Yes.
how to say no politely.
Yeah, politely, respectfully.
Yes,
Because it can be tricky, even for native speakers.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is something that we need to be able to do in all sorts of contexts, whether it's with friends
Mhm.
or at work.
Absolutely. And, when we're learning another language, we really want to be able to express ourselves clearly and confidently.
Mhm.
And sometimes that means we have to say no.
Yes, and we don't want to offend anybody.
Yeah.
So there are ways that we can say politely and, still maintain our relationships.
Exactly. It's all about, building those good relationships.
Yes.
So we need to be able to say no without offending anyone.
Yeah.
So let's look at why it's important to be able to say no in the first place. Why is this such a valuable skill to have?
Well, I think the main reason is that it allows us to set boundaries.
Absolutely. Yeah. Boundaries are so important for our well-being,
Yeah.
for, to have those healthy relationships that you were talking about.
Mm.
Because, if we keep saying yes to everything, if we never say no,
Yeah.
then people are going to expect that of us, and we're going to end up feeling resentful and overwhelmed and stressed and all those negative things.
Yeah. It's like, if you keep saying yes to everything, you're going to end up with no time for yourself
Exactly.
and no energy for
Yeah,
yourself.
yeah, and your time and your energy, they're precious.
Yeah,
These are valuable things, and we need to protect them.
absolutely. It's like having a budget.
Exactly.
You have a certain amount of money
Yes.
that you can
Yeah.
spend, and if you overspend,
Yeah.
you get into trouble.
Exactly. And it's the same with our time and energy. We need to think carefully about where we're investing them.
Hmm.
And if something isn't aligned with our values,
Yeah.
with our goals, or simply if we don't have the time or the energy for it, we need to be able to say no.
So it's not just about avoiding things that we don't want to do. It's actually about making space for the things that are important to us.
Exactly. It's about saying yes to the things that matter.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means saying no to other things.
Okay, so we've talked about why it's important to say no. But the problem is that a lot of people, particularly people who are learning English as a second language, might feel nervous or hesitant to say no
Yeah.
because they don't want to seem rude or they don't want to damage their relationship.
So it's understandable because, different cultures have different ways of communicating.
Hmm.
And what might be considered polite in one culture might not be in another.
So what can we do? How can we say no without sounding rude?
Well, there are definitely some techniques and some phrases that we can use that will help us say no politely and respectfully.
Okay, let's dive into those. What's the first tip? What's the first thing that we should do if we want to say no gracefully?
Okay, well, one really effective way to say no politely is to start by expressing gratitude.
Expressing gratitude. That's interesting because you're actually going to refuse the request.
Yeah, I know it might seem counterintuitive,
Mhm.
but trust me, it really works.
So how does that work? Why does expressing gratitude help?
Well, it kind of softens the blow. It makes the rejection feel less harsh because you're starting on a positive note. You're showing the other person that you appreciate their offer.
Okay.
You appreciate their invitation even though you can't accept it.
So it's like a little bit of a cushion
Exactly.
before you say no.
Yeah, it's like, you're letting them down gently rather than just, hitting them with a blunt no.
So what are some phrases that we can use to express gratitude in this situation?
Well, you could say something like, "Thank you so much for thinking of me, but,"
Oh.
or "I really appreciate you asking, but." And then you can go on to explain why you can't do whatever they're asking you to do.
So you're acknowledging their request
Mm.
and you're showing appreciation,
Yes.
but then you're still setting that boundary.
Exactly. And that's really important, especially in English-speaking cultures where politeness and consideration are really valued.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great first step. Start by expressing gratitude. Now, I've heard that humor can also be a good way to say no.
Yeah, humor can definitely help to lighten the mood,
Hmm.
especially if you know the person well.
But we need to be careful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to make sure that the humor is appropriate for the situation.
So when is it okay to use humor when we're saying no, and when is it not okay?
Well, it really depends on your relationship with the person, and it depends on the situation. So if you're talking to a close friend or a family member,
Hmm.
and you know that they'll appreciate your sense of humor, then a little joke or a funny comment can be a good way to say no without hurting their feelings.
Oh.
But if you're talking to someone that you don't know very well,
Yeah.
or if you're in a formal situation like at work or something, then it's probably best to avoid using humor because it could be misinterpreted.
Yes.
It could come across as unprofessional.
Or even offensive.
Yeah, and we don't want that.
No.
So yeah, I think it's really important to read the room,
Mm-hmm.
to be sensitive to the situation, to the other person's personality, and to just use good judgment.
What are some examples of some humorous ways that we could say no?
Okay, so let's say a friend invites you to a party, but you're really tired and you just want to stay at home and relax.
Yeah.
You could say something like, "Oh, I'd love to, but my pajamas are calling my name."
Okay.
Or, "My sofa and I have a hot date tonight."
Those are great examples because you're showing that you're declining in a lighthearted way.
Mm-hmm.
You know you're not taking it too seriously.
Exactly, and you're not rejecting them personally.
Okay, so we've talked about using gratitude, and we've talked about using humor. But what if we're in a situation where neither of those approaches is appropriate?
Right.
What if we really need to be assertive, and we need to set a clear boundary?
Well, in that case,
Yeah.
we need to be very clear and direct with our no,
Hmm.
but we can still be respectful.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we be assertive without being aggressive?
Well, one really useful technique is to use I statements.
I statements, okay.
So instead of saying, "You're asking for too much,"
Yeah.
you could say, "I'm feeling overwhelmed right now and I can't take on any more responsibilities."
Okay.
So you're focusing on your own feelings and you're not blaming the other person. We're just stating your limits.
And this is particularly important at work,
Yeah, absolutely.
where we need to, maintain professional relationships.
Yeah, we don't want to burn any bridges.
Right.
We want to be able to work well with people.
So using I statements can really help us to be assertive but respectful at the same time.
Exactly. And remember, setting boundaries is a form of self-care.
Yeah.
It's not selfish.
Okay. Now, I think a lot of people, even when they know that they need to say no, they might feel guilty.
Hmm.
They might feel guilty about saying no.
Yeah, I think that's very common.
Particularly if we're used to putting other people's needs before our own.
Exactly. Especially if, we've been raised to be helpful and accommodating.
Yeah. So how can we deal with that guilt? How can we overcome those feelings of guilt and feel more comfortable about saying no?
Well, I think one thing to remember is that saying no doesn't make you a bad person.
No.
It's actually a sign of strength and self-awareness. It
Yeah.
means that you know yourself, you know what you can handle, and you're not afraid to set those boundaries.
Okay, but how can we actually change our thinking to make it easier to say no without feeling guilty?
Well, one thing that I found really helpful is to focus on the positive reasons for saying no.
Okay.
So instead of thinking about what you're missing out on, think about what you're gaining by saying no.
Okay.
So ask yourself, will this free up time for something else that's more important to me? Will it allow me to rest and recharge? Will it help me to avoid burnout?
Okay, so turn it around
Exactly.
and think about the positives.
Yeah, focus on the positive aspects of saying no and the benefits that it will bring to your life.
That's a really interesting way to think about it.
Mhm.
So instead of looking at it as a negative,
Yeah.
look at it as a positive,
Exactly.
a positive choice.
And that can really help to reduce the guilt and make you feel more confident about saying no.
Okay, so we're starting to see that saying no is not a bad thing.
No, absolutely not.
It's actually a very important skill,
Yeah, it's an essential part of self-care and boundary setting.
and it can help us to live happier and more fulfilling lives.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about why it's important to say no, and we've looked at some ways to say no politely and respectfully. But what about the actual phrases that we can use?
Right. Yeah, because sometimes we need some concrete examples.
Absolutely, because it's one thing to know the theory,
Yeah,
but it's another thing to actually be able to put it into practice.
exactly. So let's give our listeners some practical tools that they can use.
Okay, so what are some of the phrases that we can use to say no politely?
Okay, well, let's imagine you're at work and a colleague asks you to do something, but you're already really busy.
Yeah.
You could say something like, I appreciate you asking, but my plate's already full with deadlines right now.
Okay, so you're acknowledging their request, but you're explaining that you just don't have the time.
Exactly. And another example could be, let's say a friend invites you to go to a concert, but you're not really into that kind of music.
Mm-hmm.
You could say something like, thanks for the invite, but I'm not really a big fan of that band.
And is it okay to just be direct and say no?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes the simplest approach is the best.
Okay.
You could simply say, no, thank you, or I'm sorry, but I can't.
Okay, and as long as you say it with a smile
Hmm.
and a friendly tone of voice,
Yeah,
it's not going to sound rude.
exactly. And sometimes, we might feel awkward about saying no directly.
Yeah.
So we can try to soften it a little bit by adding a phrase like, I'm afraid, or I wish I could, but...
I see. So we can make it sound a little bit less direct,
Mm.
but we're still communicating that same message.
Yeah, and sometimes it's helpful to give a brief explanation,
Okay.
but you don't need to go into a long, detailed story.
So for example, if someone asks you to help them with a project, you could say, I'd love to help, but I'm really busy this week.
Yeah, exactly. Just a short, simple explanation is enough.
Okay. Now, I think a lot of people worry that if they say no too often, people are going to stop asking them to do things.
Yeah, I can understand that fear.
They might worry about missing out on opportunities.
Hmm.
But I think it's important to remember that true friends and colleagues
Yeah,
are going to respect our boundaries.
absolutely.
Mm,
And,
yeah.
if someone gets upset or offended just because you said no, then maybe that's not someone that you want to be close to anyway.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So by saying no, we're actually setting those healthy boundaries.
Yes.
And we're showing people that we value our time and our energy.
And, when we set boundaries, we're actually teaching people how to treat us.
That's a really good point. So we're not just protecting ourselves, we're also helping other people to understand our limits.
Exactly. And that can actually lead to stronger and healthier relationships in the long run.
Now, you mentioned earlier that saying no can be particularly challenging in certain cultures.
Yeah. Because different cultures have different communication styles
Yeah.
and different expectations around politeness.
So, for example, in some cultures, it might be considered very rude to say no directly.
Yeah, in some cultures, you might need to use more indirect language
Mhm.
or find a way to imply that you're not able to do something without actually saying no outright.
So what are some tips for navigating those cultural differences?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be aware of those differences. So if you're interacting with people from a different culture, do some research.
Okay.
Learn about their communication style and try to adapt your language accordingly.
And I think it's always helpful to observe how native speakers in that culture communicate
Yes, definitely.
and to try to learn from their example.
Yeah, because, language is all about context.
Mhm.
It's not just about the words that we use, but it's also about how we use them.
Absolutely. So paying attention to those subtle nuances
Mm-hmm.
can really help us to communicate more effectively.
And, it can also help us to avoid misunderstandings.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, but I think there's still one important aspect of saying no that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay, what's that?
And that is the psychological barriers
Yeah.
that can make it difficult to say no.
Right. Yeah, because sometimes it's not just about knowing the right words to use.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's about overcoming our own internal fears and anxieties.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's talk about those psychological barriers and how we can overcome them.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so, one of the biggest barriers to saying no is the fear of rejection.
And I think that's something that's really deep-rooted in all of us.
Absolutely. It's part of our human nature.
Mhm.
We want to be liked, we want to be accepted,
Yeah.
and we don't want to disappoint people.
So we're afraid that if we say no, people are going to think badly of us.
Yeah, or they're going to reject us, or they're not going to like us anymore.
And this can be especially challenging, I think, for people who are learning English as a second language.
Yeah, because they might already feel a bit insecure about their language skills.
Mhm.
And they might worry that if they say no, they're going to make a mistake or they're going to sound rude.
So it's like a double whammy.
Exactly. But it's really important to remember that saying no is not rude.
No?
It's actually a sign of respect for yourself and your own time.
Okay, so how can we overcome that fear of rejection?
Well, I think one thing that can help is to reframe our thinking about saying no.
Okay.
So instead of seeing it as a negative thing, see it as a positive thing.
Okay.
See it as a way of taking care of yourself
Mhm.
and setting those healthy boundaries that we talked about earlier.
So it's about shifting our perspective
Yeah,
and seeing no as an act of self-care.
right. And another thing that can help is to practice saying no in low-stakes situations.
Okay, so like what kind of situations are we talking about here?
Well, it could be something as simple as, saying no to a salesperson who's trying to sell you something that you don't want.
Okay.
Or saying no to a friend who's asking you to do something that you don't have time for.
Okay, so those everyday situations.
Exactly. And by practicing saying no, In those low-stakes situations, you can start to build your confidence.
You get used to it and it doesn't feel so scary.
Exactly. And then when you're faced with a more challenging situation,
Yeah.
you'll be better prepared to handle it.
So it's like building up those no muscles.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now, another psychological barrier that can make it difficult to say no is guilt.
Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that.
We feel guilty about letting people down.
Mm-hmm. Especially if it's someone that we care about.
So how can we deal with that guilt?
Well, one thing to remember is that you're not responsible for other people's feelings.
Okay.
You can be kind and compassionate,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have to take on their emotional burden.
Okay, so we need to separate our own feelings
Right.
from other people's feelings.
Yeah. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for the other person is to say no.
Because if you say yes when you really want to say no,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to be able to do your best anyway.
Exactly. And that could end up leading to resentment or frustration down the line.
So it's better to be honest from the start.
Yeah. And to set those clear boundaries.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the psychological barriers to saying no, but what about the physical aspects of communication?
Right.
Because it's not just about the words that we use.
Yeah.
It's also about our body language and our tone of voice.
Exactly. So when you're saying no, it's important to maintain eye contact, to use a firm but friendly tone of voice,
Okay.
and to stand or sit up straight.
So we want to project an image of confidence.
Yes. And we want to show the other person that we mean what we say.
Okay, so by paying attention to our body language and our tone of voice, we can reinforce our message and make it more effective.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been such a helpful conversation.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
I think we've covered a lot of really important points about saying no in English.
Yeah, and I hope our listeners feel more confident now
Yes.
about using this really important skill in their own lives.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind our listeners that saying no is not a sign of weakness.
No, absolutely not.
It's a sign of strength.
Yeah, it shows that you respect yourself,
Mm-hmm.
you respect your time,
Yeah.
and you're not afraid to set boundaries.
So embrace your no.
Yes, say no with confidence.
And remember that practice makes perfect.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who want to practice saying no in a safe and supportive environment,
Yeah.
we have some great resources available on our website.
You'll find vocabulary lists, exercises, and other helpful materials that will help you to master this important skill.
The link is in the episode description.
So don't forget to check it out. And in the meantime, keep practicing your English and keep saying no when you need to.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.